Welcome to the Fall 2020 virtual launch event for the Journal, the magazine of the Kansas Leadership Center. I'm Chris Green, and I'm the managing editor of the Journal. Many of you are receiving the copy of the fall issue right now. It went out on the mail on Tuesday, and people in Wichita are starting to get it. And those of you across the state and the rest of the country should get it in the days to come. We worked very hard to meet not just our normal deadlines, but our postal service deadlines and things of that nature to ensure that we get this into your hands at least sometime before Election Day. It has a lot of great issue type discussion, and online we're doing a lot with candidates and trying to sort of summarize and contrast candidate positions, particularly in state legislative races going on in Kansas. The illustration that we saw in the video to start out the event is from illustrator Pat Byrnes, who joins us this evening. And it really captures for me how 2020 has sometimes felt like an obstacle course. Now we add voting in the middle of a pandemic on top of it at this time of really great political polarization. Our event tonight is really going to be designed hopefully to leave you feeling refreshed about your commitment to civic life and feeling empowered to be an engaged citizen during these very unusual political times, this time of disruption and conflict and uncertainty. If there's a KLC idea that I hope will be at most play tonight, it's this concept of managing self. So I think we want to explore a little bit about kind of what pushes your buttons and what makes you feel disengaged, deflated, or even cynical about politics. And let's face it, like part of a campaign is that everyone is trying to push your buttons to get you to do certain things. I think, you know, when it comes to our political climate right now, that being able to manage ourselves is absolutely critical for having difficult political conversations. Because so much of our political division right now is not just like about changing your mind about policy, it's really about identity and loyalty to a particular way of thinking about who you are or what our country should be. And when we talk about things like that, when we get to that level, I think that can be really threatening. And so in order to engage in political conversations in this day and age, I think we really have to practice getting good at being able to keep ourselves grounded and being able to stay in the game, especially when the heat gets high, because it's feels as high as it's ever been that I can remember following politics. Also, if you're familiar with the Journal and KLC, you know that we're driven by a desire to be politically open and to really bring diverse groups of people together, to really be curious about each other and to learn from each other. So if there's a ground rule that I hope we can follow tonight, it's that we bring that spirit of curiosity to everything we talk about and a willingness to hold and test multiple interpretations and points of view as we explore politics and elections, which can be a really fraught and controversial and divisive topic. But I still think it's something that's really important to talk about. And I will never cast judgment at people for feeling really passionate about politics. In fact, I really love it when people feel that way. But I think what distinguishes this space from like every other space you'll ever be in, out in the world, is that we want you to not just express your passions, but really keep a focus on learning and exploring and being curious and thinking about things that maybe you don't have a chance to think about otherwise out in the fray. So I think if we can just keep that in mind, this is going to be a really awesome hour plus, and I'm really looking forward to it and glad that you're here. So tonight is just a big night for civic engagement in general. So you're here for this event, and you'll be celebrating the release of this edition, which focuses on issues and voting in one of the most unusual elections we've ever seen. But at 6:30, KMUW FM 89.1, who's the media sponsor for tonight's event, and we're thankful for that, is going to be featuring a U.S. senatorial debate featuring U.S. Rep. Roger Marshall and State Senator Barbara Boullier, which is the U.S. Senate race is kind of the hot political talk in Kansas right now. A big poll just came out from the New York Times saying that it was going to be, it looks like a very close race. And so there'll be a debate airing on KMUW and KWCH-TV at 6:30, and then a post-debate breakdown with some of our friends from KMUW and others from 7 to 8. And then if you're still going on politics, at 8 o'clock, there's going to be a presidential debate. And KMUW will be airing special coverage of that debate with President Trump and the Democratic nominee, Joe Biden. So as I mentioned earlier, like, this is an election unlike anything that most of us have ever experienced. And we're sort of feeling it. According to the Pew Research Center, about half of all voters expect that voting will be more difficult this year than it was in 2018. So I'd like to spend just a few minutes, maybe just getting a sense of your experience and seeing the experiences of people in the room. And so Julian, who is in charge of our tech for this event, is going to be putting up some poll questions for you to answer. And we're going to talk about just your feelings about this election and have you voted yet and things of that nature, just to get a sense of some data in the room. So whenever you're ready for that, Julian, let's roll with that. So the first question is, how anxious do you feel about the election? And more anxious than usual, about the same. It seems like every single day, like, there's a news story out there to make you feel anxious about what's going to happen and what are the possibilities and all of that sort of thing going on. So I'm going to end the poll, and can everybody see that? We're feeling it a little bit. Most of us are a little more anxious than usual. So question number 2, I'm curious about how you plan to vote in the election. You may have already voted. I actually myself, I voted on Tuesday, and I didn't stand in a line. I just went to the Sedgwick County election office, and it was really smooth and easy. And it's been interesting to see the different contrast between the experience of voting going on throughout the country on social media. Wow. So most of us here are already voters. A few of us are holding out. I'm curious whether you're holding out for election day or a weekend. Or if you're submitting a mail-in ballot, there are just lots of different options for voting this year, which takes us to our next question. What method will you use to vote this fall? And if you've already voted, be sure to tell us that. So so most of us are mail-in balloters, and advance in-person balloters second, and only a handful of us are looking at voting on election day, which is, I think that's some really interesting data to sort of take into our next conversation. So with me tonight is Pat Byrnes, who is an illustrator whose work has appeared in The New Yorker. You might be most familiar with him from the Your Leadership Edge book by Ed O'Malley and Amanda Cebula. So for the fall journal, he tried to capture the stresses of voting and what it's like during the pandemic in a really humorous kind of way. So Pat, you join us tonight. Are you in Chicago?
I am indeed.
Well,
Chicago River is just out my back door here.
Yeah, and I understand that you have taken this big long illustration and put it in a printout for us. And maybe you could just take like a minute and if we didn't catch it in the video, show it to us again and tell us what's going on in this thing.
This is not a printout. This is the original artwork.
The original, yeah.
Anyway, I was about to get into cartoon geek stuff about, here's the paper and here's the, I can't see both at the same time. Anyway, So it all began with the idea of the difficulty in voting this year. Began with just the hedge maze and the thorn bushes, but the more actually we went back and forth on this, the more we thought about it, it's like that's not quite enough. There are a lot more obstacles to go through than that. And then it just started to, we got your traditional obstacle course going through barbed wire, and then of course we've got the whole mail-in voting problem, which is now exacerbated by oh, God knows what in the mail world. And there are the drop-off boxes that at the time I did this, I didn't know to have people putting out fake drop boxes or lighting them on fire. Otherwise, I would have done that. That's a good
Another
gag.
case of reality, like finding a way to be more ridiculous than what we could ever come up with ourselves.
That is the biggest complaint among cartoonists. That reality is really stealing our thunder these last few years. Then we just get into some simple stuff about the tightrope that we are all walking, and the various tricks we have to navigate, the heavy dives and the shocks that we have to overcome, and often now just various complications in voting and identifying yourself, and I mean obliquely that relates to some voter suppression laws and our nation's rich history with that. But then there's this big demon, the pandemic, which is I mean, I stood in line for not terribly long, but everybody was masked up and we were all trying to stay 6 to 12 feet away from each other, because really, to be extra safe, 12 feet is what you should be. And then just, that I thought, you're not going to do obstacles unless you get into some good pit in the pendulum kind of action. The rope bridge and the thorns, and then what is any kind of obstacle course without bees? Without bees, that's because we did have our murder hornets this year, and why not? I remember in the early part of the year when I thought the most annoying thing about 2020 was going to be having to write out the full year 2020 on our checks. Missed it by that much. Then we get over our snake pit, crawling through broken glass, and with a hat tip to Johnny Cash, the ring of fire before you make it to the end. This stuff didn't make it in the picture. This was me testing the paper, saying, do I really want to use this paper? And I thought, yeah, I do. So it was I tried to bury metaphor deep into a lot of the obstacles just so that it would seem less painful. Lord knows we all have enough pain these days.
So what did you hope people who looked at this would take away from it?
I would hope that by seeing the thoroughness and the ridiculousness of that, they would feel less alone. One of the things about this pandemic is that we're shut off. We're shut off, and our communication is with a lot of other people is through those social media bubbles, which just makes it even more threatening. And that isolation is not good. And so in a visual, lighthearted way with a positive affect, making a connection between people and saying, oh, someone else feels what I feel. That kind of empathy is, oh, Lord knows, that's what we all need more of these days, in my humble estimation, which has no right to be humble because it's a great estimation.
Well, thank you so much, Pat, and thank you for your contributions to the journal and to KLC. I think this is actually the first time we've ever had a chance to really talk face to face in a way, and it's
Such
a
as it is.
pleasure to talk with you. And thanks
Likewise.
for your work. So Pat drew about voting, and now we actually have people in Kansas voting, and hopefully their experiences are nothing like this. Uh, but we have a reporter, Jerry LaMartina from Shawnee, who's been following the issues of voting and actually wrote a primer that appears in the edition of the journal that's been printed. Jerry joins us here tonight, and he's going to tell us a little bit about what are you seeing? What are you hearing about these early days of voting? Are things, we're obviously avoiding the worst case scenario of Pat Byrnes's imagination. How are we doing in reality?
Well, I took a small dip back with my sources yesterday, and I was able to get a hold of election officials in Sedgwick and Stanton counties. And I got a hold of Katie Copal at the Secretary of State's office. Really, they all said things are going very well. Really, no problems worth mentioning, focusing on at least. Chris, told me yesterday he had been hearing that there was some problem with people who had applied for advance mail-in ballots, but then decided to go to the poll in person, possibly not realizing that when you do that, the office issues you a provisional ballot, and then they don't officially count it until they've been able to verify that you haven't voted more than once. So I wasn't able to get back a hold of Johnson County's election office. Katie said Johnson and Sedgwick were having higher incidence of that. Otherwise, smooth. Katie said, we're getting reports of a lot of long lines, but social distancing is making them longer. And so they look longer because they are, but so things have been moving efficiently. Those are the reports she's gotten from all over the state.
Yeah, that's good. That's good to hear. And even the provisional ballot thing isn't a disaster. Like as long as you don't vote your mail-in ballot, like you still get to have your ballot counted. It just won't get counted until the canvass. So when you look at the totals
Right.
on election night, it's not going to show up. So one
Mhm.
reason to vote your mail-in ballot the way it's the way you applied for it is that it just makes things go a little smoother.
Yeah.
So most of us here have already voted already. For those of us who haven't, and for those of us who still talk to our friends, what are you hearing about tips or suggestions? Like, what should we be telling people to think about as they vote?
Yeah, and all of the election offices and Katie at the Secretary of State's office kind of emphasize the same things. One of them is that, if you apply, as I just said, if you apply for a mail-in but decide to go in person, you're going to be delayed with provisional. Of course, now we're down to not too many deadlines. Remember that all counties have to start offering in-person early voting by the 27th. And that's also the deadline to apply for an advance mail-in ballot. Basic stuff such as the polls are open from 7 to 7 on election day. If you're in line, at 7 p.m., stay there because they're going to allow you to vote. I don't know if they actually set a cutoff on time, but if you're in line, you're going to be able to vote. Make sure you sign the outside of the envelope for mail-in. And apparently that's a common problem that they encounter. People just forget to do it, I guess. It's just to run over, your options are to vote in person early or in person on election day. Mail in that advance ballot or drop it off at a drop box location. That's what I did. Or you can drop it off at your polling place on election day. Let's see, and you can drop it off at your election office before election day. Those are the main things.
Well, thank you, Jerry, and thank you for
Sure.
your work and sort of sorting some of this stuff out. It's really nice to see things going really smoothly with voting in the state so far. But For a while there, it felt just a little bit uncertain when we started working on this, the how it was going to go. It's reassuring to, from the story to hear election officials talk about how confident they are, and thanks for
Yeah,
being a part of sharing that story.
sure, absolutely.
So as we know, like, we're not just voting during a pandemic, but this is also a time of increased partisanship and polarization. Republicans and Democrats not only don't see the issues differently, that they'll be voting through vastly different methods, and more voters, 83%, say it matters who wins the presidential election than at any point in the past 20 years. And these strong feelings, I mean, I don't know your experience across social media, but I sort of feel like an almost like apocalyptic fervor sometimes about what's going to happen depending on who wins the election or not. And we've even had clashes between protesters in cities, not in Kansas that I can think of yet, but in other parts of the country. And it's really left people concerned, observers concerned, about the possibility that there might be political violence associated after the election. Uh, so one of our correspondents, Jill Way in Liberal, writes in the fall edition about, one of those moments where something like this could have happened in Liberal. And Jill had a front row seat for a confrontation that occurred in Liberal last month between supporters of President Donald Trump and local Black Lives Matter protesters. So Jill, well, first of all, welcome. And could you tell us about what it was you witnessed and wrote about for the Journal?
Absolutely. Hi, it's nice to be here. Whenever the Trump train, the Pop Up for Trump rally came through Liberal last month, they had been making their way across the state, and they finally hit Southwest Kansas, and the leader of their group said that they had not experienced any counter-protesters as they had moved across the state until they hit Liberal Kansas. When they were here, they estimated that they had about 500 supporters who made their way through the city. They drove through in a big parade and then hit Light Park, the main central park in the city, to stump for Trump. And as they were making their way through the city, about 25 or so Black Lives Matter activists followed along with signs, chanting as they went, and then they came together at the park and faced off. There was a lot of heated conversation, lots of opinions being shared, but it ended up ultimately being peaceful, just people wanting to get their opinions out, it seemed.
And from some of the comments in the article, like it seems like there was a lot of passion and maybe even tension there. You'll see some of the photographs in the video we're about to show that Jill took from Liberal. What do you think allowed for it to remain peaceful? Because I imagine it had to be a surprise for the Trump protesters or for the Trump supporters to run into protest that they hadn't seen before. So what do you think allowed it to sort of end the way it did?
I think that day, more than anything, they just wanted to make their voices heard. It was so interesting because they were so vocal and so passionate, but once they got their points across, they would kind of move along a little bit. One thing I think that could have helped the situation is that Liberal is a really unique city in Kansas. The city motto is that it's the crossroads of commerce, but I would argue that it's more like the crossroads of culture, because diversity is really weaved into the very fabric of the community. In Liberal, non-Hispanic white people only make up about 28% of the community, as opposed to 75% statewide. And about 62% of the city's population is Hispanic or Latino, and 6% is Black. So it seems like that diversity comes with a lot of different opinions, and the city has been hashing that out over recent months. The Black Lives Matter activists did have another rally and a protest in June, and it was peaceful. They marched through the city, and they met up at some locations and shared their opinions. So we've seen this happen in the city before. And I do have to give some credit to the local law enforcement here. They prepared, I know, quite a bit ahead of time, as they heard chatter about the groups coming together, and they had heard some rumors of potential violence. So they had about 35 officers along the parade route, blocking roads to allow the parade to come, but also coming, and they stood between the different groups silently. They didn't intervene or share opinions, but they did position themselves there in case violence erupted. And I know that some of the Black Lives Matter activists said that they were grateful actually to have their presence there, because some of the Trump supporters had said, you know, if they weren't here, things could be different. So I have to give them some credit for their planning and preparation and for keeping calm at that event.
And you live in Liberal, and you're actually relatively new to the community, right? So you're kind of coming at this with, like, you both live there and with a little bit of fresh eyes.
Yeah, it's so, I'm from Southwest Missouri. I've only been here in Liberal for a few months, since this summer. And it's such a unique and cool community as far as the diversity goes. And just to be able to see these groups come together, to be able to be very passionate about their opinions, have very different opinions, but be able to leave feeling like there's some hope that we can have opinions but still stay safe and get along.
Yeah, so I'm sort of seeing like two patterns there that I think maybe the rest of the country can learn from Liberal. Like, one, it seems like that diversity has sort of increased tolerance for different viewpoints and a willingness, like you don't have a choice to get people who think differently than you. It's just like the nature of everyday life. And then the other is the power of authority to sort of like set the tone for people to engage in healthy civic behavior. The fact that the police were there and able to keep order and allowed both sides to be able to present their views. So
absolutely.
So thanks for bringing us those lessons from Liberal. We're grateful to you. And Jill, this was her first story she's ever written for the Journal, and so we're grateful to have her contributions in the magazine.
Thank you.
So, so we've talked about voting, we've talked about the political climate and getting along with each other. So now we're going to spend a few minutes and just talk about this election night that we're going to experience on November 3rd, a Tuesday. That's going to be kind of unlike anything I think we've ever experienced before. Like, I have given up on my ability to predict the future, but I feel like there is value in taking a look at different scenarios and thinking about what could happen. And I'm not smart enough to know what could happen, but I did find some people who, are. So for the next 12 minutes, you're going to be watching a video. It's sort of like a panel discussion distilled. And it includes political scientist Bob Beatty of Washburn University, Patrick Miller of the University of Kansas, Michael Smith of Emporia State University, and joining them is KAKE-TV senior reporter Pilar Pedraza. And they're going to be running through what to expect on election night and what we can prepare for and think about and what might actually happen and what our responsibilities and roles are in influencing healthy outcomes for our democracy, that no matter what happens, we remain a healthy democracy. So stay with us. We'll spend the next few minutes in this video presentation.
It's 11 p.m. on November 3rd, election night for the pandemic-disrupted 2020 presidential race. 4 Kansas political observers preview what might happen.
The interesting thing about this election is we have so many scenarios.
No clear winner on election night. It happened during the 2020 Iowa caucuses. No one knew who won for several days.
We had the media showing up, opening their programs on the night of the Iowa caucus, sitting there and basically waiting for the results, which is, I say, ridiculous, because the Iowa caucus is like a 4-tier process of allocating votes and delegates, and they changed all the rules for this year's Iowa caucus. And even if everything went smoothly, it was going to take quite a while. But you could see when I was clicking around in the cable news, they were really upset, the media, all of the different channels, that they did not have these results. And they really started sort of acting like this was a crisis, like this is a really bad look for democracy and everything, and gloom and doom. And that, so that's not a good look for, when the media starts saying, just because we don't have the results yet, this is a really bad night for democracy. So the expectation should be that this is a difficult process when there's so many different types of votes. On the other hand, we have the example of the Kansas primary from this last summer, where I went into a TV station to do election night, all prepared, told my wife, maybe I'll come home at 2 a.m. And we sat there, and a little before 10 p.m. news even started, we're like, well, I think most of these races are over. And meaning that it wasn't just the counting of the votes, but the actual results that were coming in told us, there's no way this candidate's coming back from this. We were able to look at some counties and say, if based on what's going on in some of these counties, this is going to be a very early night. So we have the gamut.
Indeed. While there's a lot of speculation about doomsday scenarios that leave the nation in doubt over who's going to win the presidency, such a result is not a foregone conclusion.
I've been covering elections since 1996. The only comparison I have is the 2000 election. And that one, nobody realized ahead of time it was going to be so dragged out.
Stay with us. We're about to take you on an exciting and bumpy ride.
It was just like, whoa, okay. This time, everybody is preparing for it to be dragged out. Now, whether or not it is, I don't know. 2 years ago, everybody was preparing for the Kansas governor's race to not be finished on election night. And it was done by 8 o'clock. So, it's really hard to tell, but we're all preparing for the worst, preparing for a constitutional crisis, preparing for, a Supreme Court battle, and preparing for the election night to drag out for weeks or months.
A lot of these scenarios about challenging the results and litigation, there may still be litigation, but it would be kind of beside the point. That it really requires a razor-thin election in order for this to come into play. And we may not have one, like Bob's example of the Kansas primary this summer.
People need to adjust their expectations. Voters, I think, need to understand we probably will not know a winner for sure on election night. Second, we should be aware that we should not read too much into the ballots that we have counted on election day. What we're seeing is that whereas traditionally in the past, there's not a big partisan difference in who requests and votes a mail ballot, this year there is, and Democrats are disproportionately requesting mail ballots. Election day voters will probably trend significantly more Republican, so we're not going to have a full electorate in most states counted on election day. There will likely be states that on election night, Donald Trump is winning in the votes that are counted. But as we count mail ballots that have come in or will be coming in in a state like Kansas, for example, where the mail ballots can come in up to Friday after the election, those are going to trend more Democratic.
Mail-in ballots aren't just a factor in the national race for president. Even some state and local races could be decided by them.
And that's not unusual. That is not fraudulent or illegitimate, even despite the rhetoric we're hearing now. There are processes and laws in place for those ballots to be counted. And so the full results may take some time to know.
Even with more mail-in voting this year, one thing we shouldn't be worried about is voter fraud.
Voter fraud today is extraordinarily rare. Our system is set up to make far more errors of rejecting ballots of people who do have a right to vote than accepting ballots that they shouldn't have accepted. We err on the side of rejecting ballots, not acceptance. But the real issue at this point is now being fought out in the court of public opinion.
It might take a little longer to know the winner of this year's election, but eventually we'll have our answer. The biggest problem is whether enough of us are willing to accept the results that don't bring our preferred candidate a victory.
There has been interesting polling on this over the years, and I believe that the last presidential election, where out in the electorate, people like us, average citizens, the last presidential election where average citizens of both parties agreed that the outcome was fair and legal, was 1996. Ever since 2000, the party that lost that election, its voters said the outcome was fraudulent, it was illegitimate.
The divide dates back to the dispute over the 2000 presidential election.
What Bush v. Gore did was it also ushered in the era of fraud rhetoric, whether it is casting aspersions on voters or casting aspersions on the people who are counting the votes or judges. And I think it set us up as a society, and I'm speaking about average people here, not just what our politicians are saying. I think it has set us up as a society to believe that the only way that our side, the good, virtuous, holiness, our side, the only way we can lose is through fraud.
But there are things you can do as an individual to not only make the election go smoother, but also strengthen the civic culture. First off, seek good information.
For the love of God, don't get your news from social media. Social media is for and was designed for entertainment. We have wonderful professional news outlets that hire professional journalists and teams of fact checkers that validate information before it's reported. For heaven's sake, please don't get your news from social media.
Pedraza, who has been reporting on election security over the past year, advises voters to get their questions in early, well before Election Day. Be mindful of giving yourself time. Last minute always leads to mistakes, and that's on anybody's part. So if you have questions or concerns, remember election officials are getting busier every day. If you have questions or concerns, they're perfectly willing to answer those questions, but the sooner you can raise them, the better. Because the later you wait, the more harried and harassed they're going to be, the less detailed of an answer you're going to get, and the longer it's going to take you to get an answer. You wait till Election Day, and you may not get your answer in time simply because they're busy. If you're able to, you can volunteer in your community to be a poll worker, even if you're not old enough to vote. And the little things matter. By ensuring that you are getting your vote counted as intended, you'll be helping not just yourself, but increasing trust in the entire election process. That's important because there's no denying that our country's democracy is at a precarious juncture.
It's my job to know how democracies fall apart, and they do. And I see us on that path, and it is not new, it is not Donald Trump, it is a decades-long path that the entire political spectrum, the entire ideological spectrum has engaged in. I would be lying to you if I said I was 100% certain that there was not going to be violence after this election, whether that comes from the left or the right. Like, I have a genuine fear as a political scientist that whatever side loses this election, and I'm not saying we're going to have like what happened in Kenya after an election a few years ago where thousands of people died. No, I'm not. I really don't think that's going to happen. But more isolated acts of terrorism, of violence, in whatever way that they occur. I have never thought as a political scientist that this is something I'm afraid of. And I genuinely am.
But it's not something that we have to let happen. We can do something about it as individuals and as Kansans.
I think one thought I would have is, for average citizens of any age, it's that, democracy is supposed to make you uncomfortable. It is supposed to challenge you. And that really runs counter to how probably most of us function politically, where we have relatively few people that we engage with politically, and they're people who already agree with us. And we create our own echo chambers in our social lives, to the point where we believe that it's impossible that a majority of society might disagree with us in any way whatsoever. I think that's unhealthy. And I think average citizens have a lot more power than you realize to change that process if you care to change it. Some of us are perfectly happy to live in a bubble and think that that bubble is best, especially if it suits our political goals. But you have the power to engage with people who might not always agree with you. You have the power, if you want people to vote their ballots correctly, if you want people to think differently about democracy, you have the power to have those conversations in your own social networks. And those are conversations that we are often afraid to have. We lump politics with religion and sex and money as these taboo topics, and they can be conflictual. But I think that also feeds that bubble. So I would say you don't have to necessarily depend on Donald Trump or Laura Kelly or Joe Biden or anyone else to change politics for you. You have the power to start to change that yourself if you care to change it.
Well, thank you to Bob Beatty and Patrick Miller and Michael Smith and Pilar Pedraza for sharing your thoughts in that video, and thank you so much to DJ Wetter, who did the voiceover as well as the editing for that video. And I thought it was just a really cool way to segue into the next conversation, which Ed O'Malley, the president and CEO of the Kansas Leadership Center, and Sean Rojas, our director of civic engagement, are going to lead you in a conversation about what leadership looks like at this time of intense political difference.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. And thanks everybody for being a part of this conversation. I want to say hello to Pat. Pat, it's so good to see you again. Pat and I shared the best burrito you could imagine in Chicago when we were talking about working together on the cartoons that wound up in the Your Leadership Edge book. So Pat, so good to see you again. And thanks for being so important to KLC over the years. You've done a lot for us beyond that book, and we really appreciate it. So it's so good to see you again.
My pleasure. Absolutely. At any time.
And I know you have a better burrito place for us to eat at next time. So when the pandemic's over, I'll meet you there. Sean and I want to tee up a conversation, and he's going to ask you a question here in just a minute, but I want to kind of offer some framing for the group. What's on my mind right now is the difference between being politically active and being someone exercising civic leadership. I think everybody on this Zoom tonight, I would call politically active. And I would say most of the people who interact with KLC are politically active. And by the way, Sean and I don't have answers to these questions. We want this group to help lift up answers. So the framing is, the idea, like, what's the difference between being, this isn't the question, but between being politically active and exercising civic leadership. I'm reminded of, the folklore of, the founders leaving Constitutional Hall and a woman asking Benjamin Franklin, well, sir, what kind of government did you create for us? And the lore is that Benjamin Franklin said, a republic, if you can keep it. If you can keep it. So, I mean, the question is like, what does that mean? What does it mean if you can keep it? What does it mean to keep a republic? And my assumption is it means something beyond just participating in voting, although participating in voting should be celebrated. My assumption is it means something about citizens exercising leadership in the way that those of us at the Kansas Leadership Center talk about leadership as something that's disconnected from authority, leadership as something that is available to all of us, regardless of our level of authority. So we want to explore that tonight. And like we often do at KLC, we use these smaller gatherings to help inform our thinking. So this conversation is going to help us as we continue to think about and expand our thinking about civic engagement, our thinking about the intersection between civic engagement and civic leadership. So with that framing, Sean, let me toss it to you for any opening comments you might have, and then I'll let you offer the question that we'll have people wrestle with in some small groups. Now, by the way, we are going to send you to small groups in a minute, but you're not allowed to leave the Zoom right now. I know sometimes that happens. You're not allowed to leave the Zoom right now because we need you. Those of you who haven't met Sean, although most of you probably have, Sean's been engaged with the Kansas Leadership Center from almost the very beginning, has done a number of key things for this organization, and is our Director of Civic Engagement right now. A highly civically engaged guy himself, and somebody very deeply, intimately involved with the Kansas Leadership Center framework and ideas. So Sean, your opening thoughts, and then I'll let you tee up the question for the small groups.
Yeah, I think when I think about voting and how big a deal voting is, and I love the push for voting, and we need to get everybody to vote. And, you know, we're proud of our alumni at KLC. We know they vote in high numbers, but we also know voting is maybe in some ways a baseline to get things accomplished. So voting isn't enough, and we think about leadership in addition to voting. So while voting is great, and for some people it's a huge step, but if you vote every year and you vote all the time, you know, we might be pushing you at KLC kind of what's next. And that'll take me into our small group question. So what does civic leadership look like for you after the election, regardless of the outcome? So Julian, we're going to put folks in small groups, and I would say give us about 6 minutes, and you will come back and we can report out and hear how your conversation went.
All right, friends, I am placing us into groups for 6 minutes. See you soon.
Being politically active, which is a good in and of itself, and this idea of civic leadership. So what's the relationship? What's the similarities? What's the distinction? You know, what was Franklin talking about when he said, if you can keep it, right? Is just voting keeping a republic, or is there something else about securing the container that is our civic culture, our civic life? So Sean, you and I talked earlier, we don't exactly know how people are going to answer this question. But what I'd love you to do, folks, is to start, if you could put some thoughts in the chat about what you heard when you were in the small group. Or what you said, what you shared in the small group. Of course, the rule here is if you're uncomfortable sharing what's on your mind, just share what you heard somebody else say, right? It doesn't matter, right? Just the more thoughts, the better. But we'd love to see some stuff in the chat about what you heard or what you offered in terms of Sean's question. And we'd love to have some of you share with your voice, if you're willing. So if you're willing to share with your voice, please unmute and let us know what you're thinking about. And we'll also kind of riff and build off what's in the chat box. There. So good stuff is coming in the chat. Thank you for that. Who would like to use their voice to share what they were thinking about with Sean's question? Jackie, is that your hand up? Or are you just gesturing? Okay, all right. Careful, you might get called on.
Chair, this is Lori. We were talking in our group kind of about how civic leadership is really something that needs to happen all the time. I think you could probably argue political activism should as well, but it seems to be more on a cycle, and the heat changes, based on the elections and that sort of thing. Whereas civic leadership is something that we really ought to be paying attention to in between all of those cycles, and that heat might depend on, the issues in your community, and how we also talked a lot about dialogue, and how do you continue to have dialogue right after the election and continuing throughout that cycle to continue to engage in your community.
Lori, thanks for getting us going. It's good to see you again.
You too.
Great to have you with us. And what you talked about made me think about. We've talked a lot at KLC about how, yes, we should have all been stockpiling PPE before the pandemic. Our institutions, our homes, we should have all been doing that. But we also should have been stockpiling really high quality civic engagement. Like the lack of that high quality civic engagement, we're paying the price for it in some respects with how we're trying to respond to the pandemic. So I appreciate you getting us going about this idea that civic leadership is beyond political advocacy. We'd love some other folks to get in, and Sean, I'll trust you to be looking at the chat box there to see what you want to pull out into the conversation. So would somebody else like to get their voice in, or Sean, do you see something there in the chat box you want to lift up?
Well, what I'm seeing in the chat box is a lot of people mentioning having conversations with folks, and that's really neat because that's available and open to anyone to be able to do that. But having, it seems like there's a theme so far of having conversations with folks who disagree with you and being able to manage yourself in those conversations to focus on learning and not just trying to win the argument. And I think, as you all might know, we have something known as Journal Talks that tries to do just that. And it seems like that's a big theme here so far.
It also makes me think about so if somebody wants to not just be politically active, but exercise civic leadership in relationship to this election, in relationship to this moment in our country, what would that look like? I mean, what would it look like? Should we schedule the conversations now? By the way, we have an election debrief a few days or a week, I think, after the election that we're partnering with KMUW on. But I mean, should each of us, right? I mean, if you're somebody who is helping keep the republic, should you be thinking now about who are those voices who think very differently from you, who will either be thrilled by the outcome of the election or devastated by the outcome of the election? I mean, should we be right now, kind of scheduling that conversation with Uncle Max or our neighbor, Susie or something like that? Because it's one of those things where it was saying that we should, find those conversations is one thing, but how do we actually do it? And yeah, Shelley, go ahead, hop in.
So Ed, I've already volunteered you for something. I haven't told you yet, but so there's many of you may have heard of a group called StoryCorps that started in New York, and now there's something like 600,000 recorded conversations of like me with my grandma or whatever. Well, they just launched a new program called One Small Step, and we're very happy they launched it in Wichita. But that's exactly what they're trying to do. Instead of being me and my grandpa, it's going to be, maybe I'm a staunch liberal and they're going to pair me with a staunch Republican, and we're not going to talk about that, but we're going to talk about each other and create the humanness and respect for human life, and our own opinions. So that's started now in Kansas. So anybody who's interested in that, I'm at the Community Foundation. My email's on the website. Just shoot me a note and let me know. But that's exactly what they hope. And it was imperative that they get One Small Step launched before the election, to try to create that space. And I can connect you to whomever, if there's even a way KLC can get involved in that. But it's a neat project, and that's the purpose, is to have those. But I say, yeah, schedule those meetings now and pick people and the whole point is to have a civic conversation and a civilized conversation. So, and I put your name on the list, Ed. So.
Hey, I'd be happy to be on there, Shelley, and we'd be happy as KLC to help connect more people to it. I was actually talking with Sarah Jane from KMUW earlier today, and about that. So happy to be involved. And I think there's something like I think we're beginning to get to something that like the election is so dominant in our thinking, and maybe like what part of responding to Franklin is scheduling something, like planning something that we don't have to do, that isn't required of us, but that could be an antidote for the tough times that Patrick Miller in the video was talking about. I don't know about you all, but that gave me some chills, not in a good way. And I actually, when I saw that, to be candid, I thought to myself, I mean, do we really want to even like air that, And I think it's fine that we did. And it's important that we talk candidly, but also it feels like it should elevate our sense of responsibility of what's required. And like what's required to help. I mean, I have a candidate I want to win. You have a candidate you want to win, right? How do we do something that isn't just about helping our side win the day, but is about helping, like strengthen the container that is the American experiment. And it is an experiment. There's never been a democracy last this long before, ever. We're in uncharted territory. This never happened. So it's interesting to think about. I'm curious what other folks are thinking about, what else you want to share, what else you want to sign people up for, like Shelley just did. Or Sean, things you're seeing in the chat box.
Well, Lauren says she has to talk to her aunt to have a tough conversation with her aunt. So Lauren, thanks for, we all know, we all have this similar aunt. So
let us know how it goes, Lauren. I think there's earlier this week, I was in some conversations with some people, and we were talking about the cycles that we go through in society. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. There's a thesis about what's going on in the world. The thesis for so long had been the traditional founding of our country and how we thought about it, how we talked about it, right? Antithesis, the 1619 Project, right? Presenting a different way of thinking about it, right? And then the cycle throughout human history has always been synthesis, like, creating a new sense of what it all means. And I wonder, not to get too theoretical, too philosophical, but I wonder if part of what we're getting at here is that the exercise of civic leadership is about creating synthesis, finding ways to create synthesis about what's happening in our system, in our world, in our society. And creating synthesis feels different than advocating for either your thesis or your antithesis. It feels like it's a different activity. Sean, what do you see there in the chat?
Well, so Raquel shared an interesting comment. I think there's been it's kind of connected to some other themes, but she mentions it's like civic engagement is like being in a relationship. You don't always get what you want, and conversations aren't always easy. So yeah, I guess I'm thinking about, relationship with my wife. They're rough sometimes. I get in trouble often, but it's obviously, really meaningful and important to me. And yeah, it doesn't go perfect, even though that's something that I care about. I care a lot about. It's not easy. It doesn't go smooth all the time. And I think connecting that to civic engagement is interesting. So I don't know, Raquel, if you're on the call, would you mind, you want to add to that?
Well, I am here, and yeah, thanks for putting me on the spot like that. It occurred to me in our small group how much my civic engagement after the election will be a lot like a relationship. It's not something I will quit doing. And regardless of the outcome, whether it goes the way I want it to or not, it's not something that I'm going to walk away from, that I'll just stay in it and stay engaged and keep working. And it's worthy of my time and effort. And that feels like a lot like a relationship to me. So I'm gonna keep thinking about it like that and just explore that idea a little bit further.
That was good. Thanks for connecting it to that.
Raquel knows we love to put people on the spot, so everybody be forewarned. You might be next. The next question is a familiar question. Those of you who've been involved with KLC for a while will know we often like to have people help us like describe what it would look like. So the question is, if we had a super healthy culture, real technical term there, super healthy culture, okay? If we had a super healthy civic culture, what would you see in the days and weeks after the election? Okay? And maybe we do, maybe this is what we'll see, but sometimes it's useful to name like what would be the evidence of a super healthy civic culture. It not only can it help us know if we're going to get there, but it can also give us clues as to what those of us, individuals who are on this Zoom, or the 12,000 Kansans who are alums of the Kansas Leadership Center, what they could be actively trying to make happen, in their part of our state or their part of our world. So if we had a super healthy civic culture, what would you see in the days and the weeks after the election? What do you think? Add some thoughts to the chat box if you don't mind, or use your voice What would we see in the state? And by the way, we've got about 4 minutes left, so we're winding down here in just a minute. But what would we see if we had a super healthy civic culture? Carol gets us going with the healthy civic culture post-election would be kudos to the other side. Kudos to the other side. Thanks for getting us going, Carol. Susan, attempts at getting to unity. Attempts at getting to unity. Mature leadership is what Shelley offers. I think back to 2016. I had a weird situation in 2016. The day after the election, I started the day in a group of people who I would probably say 90% of them had voted for Trump. But that was in the morning. By the afternoon, I was in a different group, and I would say it was about 90% of them had voted for Clinton. Different feelings, different atmosphere in both groups. But one thing I didn't feel in either group, I remember this so viscerally, I didn't feel any thought or empathy for the other side, which I think is what Carol is referencing and Susan is helping us think about. So thanks for offering that. Sean, what do you see in there you want to lift up?
Yeah, I mean, about the other sides and, my side wins or their side wins, but also, I think having an importance of local elections and local races, hopefully some of the people that you voted for won, and it's not all, weighing on one race only, that there's multiple races, there's multiple elections, and, work still has to happen. And it seems like a good act of leadership would not be disengaged if one race goes the wrong way. You would want to stay with it, even if your candidate loses in one race.
Ed, I would add something.
You bet, Aubrey, go ahead.
Just to follow along that, it probably sounds remedial, but I've been coaching myself that I need to show up the next day. Just either way, however, whether it goes my way or the other way, I need to show up, for my staff, for my family, for my kids, for our community, and thinking about, well, what meetings will I attend? What will that look like? What will my message be on that day to everybody I see? And along those lines, I've been thinking about between now and the election and then after the election, who has the microphone and can we control that? Someone who brings a message of unity and resilience to our community rather than division. So for example, who says the prayer at our Rotary meeting? You know, can we just choose wisely? So the day before the election, the day after the election, you know, just to think about those things. I'm in Hutchinson, we're a smaller community. I do feel like we can control some of that. You know, we're in these public places where people gather. Who has the microphone and what are they saying? No matter what side of the aisle they're on, is important at this time, because we don't want more divisiveness on the backside of this.
Aubrey, I love what you're saying, and we're going to let that comment send us out here in just a minute, although keep your thoughts coming in the chat box. Aubrey, what I love about what you're offering is that I hear you saying, like, we need enough people whose purpose is about the civic container, more so than their purpose is about this specific election.
Thank you.
You know?
Yes.
You know, like, look, you've cast your vote, most of you. You've cast your vote. Maybe you're going to rally more folks to vote for your preferred candidates. Go for it. But I hear Aubrey saying, like, maybe keeping a republic means more people whose purpose is strengthening the container than it is winning the day. You know, that the whole idea of this country is about the government was created to preserve our rights and our ability to live the life we want to live and pursue the happiness we want to pursue. And I think remembering that and thinking about that and planning for that and plotting for that and having enough purpose in your heart for the container that is American civic life, that you're thinking now about, you know, who's doing the prayer at Rotary on Wednesday? You know, what does it look like the next day when I show up? How do I prepare myself to show up either way and know that the opportunity to exercise leadership, the opportunity to strengthen the civic fabric is still there for you as an individual? Chris, thank you and your amazing team for putting together another fabulous issue of the Journal and for this conversation tonight. Thank you all for participating. Add some more ideas in the chat if you'd like. You know, we'll capture these ideas and use them. DJ, thanks for putting together the great video. Pat, good to see you again. All the journalists involved with the magazine, thank you very, very much. Do a great job, everybody, exercising civic leadership and keeping the republic for the next few weeks and beyond. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Be well.